Okay, I hope you're able to see my screen.
Yeah, Ruchika, we can.
Great. So hi, everyone. I'm Ruchika Nambiar. I'm a 29-year-old artist, designer, and writer based in Bangalore, India. My practice is, as you might have said, some of you might have seen, is very interdisciplinary, and I tend to combine art, design, and writing to create storytelling and narrative experiences. So to give you a little bit of background, I majored in visual communication design from Srishti Institute of Art Design and Technology, after which I went on to then work as a research assistant, a teaching assistant at my college. And while I was there, I was acting as a kind of like a project coordinator at Art in Transit, which is a public art lab that creates art and design interventions in and around metro stations in the city. And after that, I kind of went completely to the other side of the spectrum. And then I went on to spend 3 years as a senior interaction designer at Harman International. That was a far more corporate job. I worked in their UX strategy team, and my job was, in fact, basically kind of coming up with creative ways to pitch to our various clients, and how to use narrative and storytelling techniques to create our pitches and our customer solutioning experiences. And that's what I did at that job. After 3 years at Harman, I then kind of went on to establish my own independent practice. And on my own, I work on a host of different creative projects and endeavors. For example, The Breadcrumb is a graphic memoir that I wrote and illustrated. It's a coming of age story that kind of touches upon themes of individuality and mortality. As you've seen, the Dollhouse project is basically, it's one of my most recent art projects, and it's an interactive social media story that's set in a miniature universe. And like you saw, the Dollhouse itself was kind of a centerpiece of that. And it's been kind of designed and gone about like a real home. The Lilliput Proletariat is a public art installation that I did in one of the metro stations here in Bangalore, where I've created this intricate layered image that spins a dystopian story around the surrounding neighborhood. So it's fashioned almost like an aquarium, and the illustration is constructed layer by layer to create a 2D diorama. My research work deals in the areas of cultural philosophy, anthropology, media studies. The book I'm writing currently deals with how our mind processes experiences, turns them into concepts, how the media we consume informs our understanding of the world around us. And I also do design consulting. I do consulting for brands and businesses, and my work mainly focuses on brand strategy and publication design, sometimes UX, but mostly brand strategy and publication design. I also run the Creative Finishing School, which is it's a personalized mentorship program I run that's more focused on long-term engagement and building long-term relationships with a dedicated group of mentees that I work with. And most of them have a very interdisciplinary artistic practice, and I basically focus on kind of helping them shape their career trajectory over time, and how to kind of shape a holistic practice over time. And finally, another project that I've recently begun is The Quaver, which is an online cultural critique magazine that aims to pick out exemplary pieces of media, whether it's a movie, a book, an episode from a TV show, or even a video game, and then publish detailed long-form critiques of the same. But what I'm here to talk to you about today, and as you can see, a lot of my work involves storytelling in various ways. So, I'm going to be talking to you today about how to use storytelling to make a better pitch. Now, when I say pitch, I mean that in the broadest possible sense. A pitch can be any medium through which you're trying to sell something. So you could be selling an idea, or you could be selling a product or service, or you could even be selling yourself. And so a pitch can take a variety of forms. You can have things like an elevator pitch, or a project proposal, an investor deck, a sales deck, an explainer video, or maybe you're putting together a case study for your website, or you're putting together a portfolio or a personal website. And I've put together very fundamental narrative techniques such that anyone can use them. So it's not just for designers or creative professionals. No matter what your job or your industry, you're always trying to sell something to someone. And I've kind of put together these techniques in a way that they can be adapted to fit all of those scenarios, despite your skill level, despite your background or experience. But before I get into the specific techniques, let me talk a little bit about why storytelling is such a crucial skill set. So, of course, the dictionary, defines a narrative as a spoken or written account of connected events. It's basically a story. But I like to think of it more as a framework for persuasion. And let me tell you what I mean by that. a narrative has the power to transform you, right? No one is ever the same person they were at the beginning of the story. A good story, at the end of a good story, you might care about something that you didn't care about before. You might empathize with someone that you couldn't understand at first. And so a narrative has this transformative power. And what it does that because a narrative has a way of easing its audience into a more suggestible state of mind. It's a very subtle, unobtrusive tool for persuasion because you never feel threatened by a story and your guard is automatically lowered. So if someone comes up to you and tells you a really controversial opinion to your face, that can feel like an attack and it'll trigger your instinct to defend yourself. But if the same controversial idea is presented in the form of a story and you're kind of gently guided through it, you're much better primed to absorb it and empathize with it and understand a foreign point of view. And that's the power that narrative has. And it's able to do this because a narrative basically helps you insert information within a framework of emotion. That's essentially what a narrative does. So for example, no one ever says, I find this joke funny, right? That's just you conveying information. Nobody says it like that. Instead, what you say is you say something like, ha ha, and then you might follow it with an emoji or a laughing emoji or whatever it is. And when you do that, that's when you allow the other person to experience how funny you found the joke. And that's essentially what narrative techniques can do for you, is that they help you convey that information within a framework of emotion. But now let's face it, the material that we all work with on a day-to-day basis is obviously no Game of Thrones. We are often putting together portfolios, or we're putting together case studies or investor decks or proposals for government bids, or the content may not be particularly gripping. So how is it that storytelling can be relevant to us? Now, typically, when we think of storytelling, people kind of tend to think of storytelling as this sort of playful, childlike format that's mainly geared towards entertainment, right? It has kind of a childish edge to it. So whenever we think of storytelling, we often just think of one structure. We think of a goal, and then there's a problem, there's a solution, and then there's usually a moral at the end of the story. Now, this is the overarching structure, but that's not really where it ends, because there's a lot more to the micro-mechanics of narrative design. And those are the aspects that we're going to be focusing on today, because it's these subtle micro-techniques that come in handy in our business context of today. So how can these micro-techniques then be applied to our everyday business scenarios? That's what we're going to be delving into today. So the first thing you want to think about is how to structure your overall flow. How do you make sense of all the various pieces you have floating around in your head and arrange it in a way that makes sense to somebody who's completely unfamiliar with it, right? So there's a vast array of narrative techniques you can use to structure your content. And you may have a fourth wall, you may have a flashback, or a in medias res, or a frame story, or a narrative hook, or foreshadowing, red herring, different things. And there are ways to interpret all of these things within our professional context too. But I'm going to be focusing on a few key techniques. And these are the most standard narrative techniques that almost all stories rely on. And those are the ones that I'm going to be focusing on today. So your most basic storytelling structure looks something like this. You have a blurb to give them a preview beforehand. You have a hook to reel people in. Then you have a premise or a problem that needs to be solved. You have a climax, and then you have resolution or closure. And then after that, you might even have a cliffhanger, though not all stories need to have that. Now, this is a structure you can rely on for pretty much anything and any kind of story and any kind of content that you're creating. There may be some variations, of course. For example, you may choose to combine your hook and your premise into one. But essentially, this is the structure that you can rely on. So when you start with a blurb, now this isn't necessarily part of your pitch. You're basically asking, okay, how do you invite your audience in? How are you setting up their expectations? It doesn't have to be a part of your pitch. It acts more like a preamble to your pitch, and it can be separate and external to it. So you wouldn't buy a book without reading at least a short synopsis of it on the back, or you wouldn't buy a movie ticket without watching a trailer. Think of it kind of like an invitation card. It's not the event itself, but it's something you deliver to your audience separately beforehand to give them some indication of what to expect before they dive in. Now, in a business context, that could mean literally just be your covering email, right? If you're sending a proposal or a portfolio or a press kit over email, how are you giving them a snapshot of what to expect? No one's going to open anything without having some idea of what they're in for. Or, this could be a concept note at an exhibition, right? Now, this is a mistake that I often see a lot of students or young artists and designers making whenever they're putting together a concept note or a jury presentation or proposing a project, especially if it's an art project. They tend to kind of go on and on about the background and the inspiration and their process, and oh, this book was inspired by my mother's vintage sari collection or whatever it is, and they'll talk a lot about their background and their inspiration. But at the end of it, I'm still wondering, okay, what is your project? What is it? Did you make a book? Did you design a board game? Did you create a film? Did you create an app? And that's something that I almost always find lacking whenever I see a proposal especially from students, is that it makes the what of the project is usually missing in that first initial glimpse of the project. And if I don't know the what of the project, it makes it really difficult for me to engage with the why or the how. You may tell me a lot of things about your inspiration or your process, but I have no framework within which to situate those things. So you want to very quickly mention the what of the project straight up, So for example, this could even be the way that you put together the log line on your website banner. So if you can see in this example, it says, the heading says, engage your audience in minutes, but right under that, it says a powerful video communication tool for companies of all sizes. So the question of what the thing is answered right in the beginning. Or similarly, when I'm putting together a written project proposal, I always like to start with an overview section or in a nutshell section where I provide a brief glimpse of the whole project so that you kind of get a snapshot of exactly what this thing is or what it is that you're getting into before you actually dive in, right? Or it could just be your title or designation when you're putting together a portfolio. You're telling somebody what it is that they can expect from you. You're telling them, okay, I am such and such person. I am a UX designer, or I am a furniture designer, or I am a product designer, whatever it is. And you're kind of just giving them like this very brief nutshell version of what it is that they can expect from you. So you always kind of, whatever it is, you want to give them a rough outline of what to expect. You always provide an outer framework first, and then you go about filling it in. You want to start with giving them a very tangible sense of what to expect. And then you can spend the rest of your presentation coloring it in and filling in all of the details. But you always kind of start with that outer framework. And you essentially want to get to the what of whatever it is that you're doing while you still have their attention. You want to get to it ideally within the first 1 or 2 or 3 lines itself, because it makes it really difficult to engage with the why or the how if I'm still left reeling about the what. And the what is the sort of thing that acts as an axis for me to kind of arrange all of the other information that you give me around it. And then we move into the hook. So what is your bait? How are you drawing them into your thought process? This is when you actually begin the narrative of your pitch. They've opened your attachment or they've sat down to listen to your presentation. How are you going to reel them into your world and your priorities and your thought process? So there are many ways you can do this. You could perhaps start with a question that makes them ponder, like, did you know bubble wrap was originally invented as wallpaper? Whatever it is that's relevant to your particular context. Or you could start with a quote that makes them, aspire to some kind of an ideal. Build something 100 people love, not something 1 million people kind of like. Or you could start with a what if scenario where you're making them imagine something. You might be making them imagine something scary, or you might be making them imagine something that's very idealistic and utopian. Whatever it is, you're making them imagine something. Or you might want to start with a powerful statistic that makes them kind of surprised or worried or nervous, right? People spend 7 years of their lives lying awake, waiting to fall asleep. Whatever it is, you get the idea. So whatever it is, you want to elicit some kind of an emotional response or intrigue, but you also want to ensure that you resolve the hook at the end, that you don't leave it unresolved. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we come to the closure phase. But then we move into the premise. So now, what is your premise? What is the problem you're trying to shed light on, and why is it worth thinking about? What is the context of your narrative? What is the background of this? And one way to kind of go about structuring your premise is to focus on your protagonist. Who's at the wheel of the story? Now, this can be interpreted in many different ways. Who is facing the problem? This may not always be an obvious protagonist. One, of course, one obvious option is obviously your user or your consumer, especially if you're working on like a service design in the service design field or in the UX design field, where your user or your consumer is is usually your protagonist. And this is the phase at which you might want to start focusing on your user research or presenting your insights around your user. Things like their pain points or journey maps or empathy maps or user reviews or your user personas, things like that, that kind of really flesh out who is at the wheel of the story and what's important to them, what is troubling them, what are their aspirations, et cetera, et cetera. Or less obviously, if you're working in a different type of industry, for example, if you're working in like the social welfare space or the social justice space and things like that, maybe it's a community that is the protagonist of your story. Maybe you want to then delve into their stories, talk about what kinds of anecdotes you can pull up to kind of really flesh out what their lives are like. Or maybe you're talking about the world at large. Maybe you're talking about a bigger issue that's kind of affecting the planet at large, like waste management or climate change. And you might want to then kind of tap into whatever data that you have and present your data visualizations or your statistics. But whatever it is, what you want to do is you want to build up a sense of urgency. You want to use your content in a way that kind of creates a sense of urgency. And you want to be making them think, okay, why is it necessary to address this issue now? What is so urgent about it? That's the sense that you want to build up in your premise or your problem phase of things. And that's when you kind of come to the climax. What is all of this leading up to? What is the meat of your pitch? And this is where you really kind of get down to the meat of your idea. What are you finally here to sell them on? And this is where you try to deliver the most impact in your flow, right? So now this could finally be your actual solution or your service. You could, maybe it's a demo video, maybe it's an explainer video. We did this quite often at my last job, where we would put together what we used to call blue sky videos, where we would basically paint this we would put together this video that paints this very idealistic picture of what the client's solution can look like, and we'll kind of create like this hypothetical user journey to show them what the solution can look like. And so we'd kind of get them excited about them being able to have this sort of solution that we can present to, that we can do for them. And that used to be kind of the highlight of our pitch. Or it could even be, you're revealing a particular product, you're using mock-ups, you're using an interactive prototype or an app demo, or you're highlighting certain features in the product and things like that. This is where you kind of want to spend more time to kind of really go into details, zoom into specific details and talk about what makes your solution special and kind of really spend some time on it. Or for example, if you're more in the spatial design or field of architecture or interior design and things like that, maybe this is where you're presenting your concept or your idea for a particular space, or you're presenting the design direction or the visual language that you're going to be employing. But whatever it is, you want to kind of do it in a way that creates impact. So even if it's just a written proposal, this is where you want to spend your time fleshing out the what of your pitch. You've given them a brief glimpse of it earlier, and here's where you want to start fleshing it out. So this is where you really want to fill in the colors and the details. You want to be very visual with it. You want to be, high impact with it. You want to deliver impact, whether it's through your words or through typography or through image or video. Make sure that it's rendered with more impact than your presentation so far, so that you're kind of taking them on an emotional journey and you're allowing them to experience a bit of a high when they come to this stage. And then you move into closure. So what is the resolution that you're providing? How is this vision going to come to fruition? These are the questions that you want to answer in the closure phase. And now what you also want to do here is resolve the hook that you set up in the beginning. So for example, if you asked a question where you're making them ponder, in the closure section, what you want to do is, what is your answer and why are you qualified to answer it? Or if you set up a what if scenario where you're making them imagine something or dream something, how are you equipped to make that vision a reality? Or if you started off with a powerful statistic that makes them kind of wary and nervous and worried, why are you capable of combating this challenge? You want to give them more of a sense of hope and confidence in your ability in the closure section. That's kind of the note that you want to leave them on. So you can do this in a variety of ways. So for example, if you're putting together a pitch deck, you might want to end with your services or your offerings or the industries that you serve or the expertise that you have. Or you might want to back it up with, things like your recognition, your credentials, or press or awards that you've gotten and things like that. You may want to, kind of briefly dive into various success stories of yours or clients that you've worked with and projects that you've done for them that might be a good testament to your ability. And you might also want to, this is the phase in which you might also want to start revealing things like your plan of action or your execution roadmap, your timeline, testimonials, your clientele, who you worked with. Now, in some cases, for example, building a portfolio, or if you're making a cold call, you may choose to move this section up, higher up in the flow and talk about your credentials early on. I personally prefer to get to it only at the end and focus more on the ideas and solutions and the work that I've done so far. But I'll tell you where it can come in handy. If you're creating a press kit or you're applying for a prestigious grant or an award of some kind, or maybe a government bid where your reputation and your credentials might pull some weight, in those scenarios, you might want to move this section higher up in the flow, and you might want to get to this part a little earlier in the flow rather than at the end. But in general, if you're pitching to someone to give you some kind of work or to kind of hire you for some kind of a work or a project or a job, they'll more likely be interested in what you can do for them and what you've done for others so far. So as a general rule of thumb, you want to maybe get to this towards the end after you've already kind of shown them what it is that you're trying to do for them. So you want to close by basically giving them a sense of hopefulness and confidence that you are the right person for this job. And that's the essential goal with the closure phase. And then, of course, you have a cliffhanger. Now, every kind of pitch doesn't need a cliffhanger, but it's a useful thing to keep in mind if you're hoping to build a long-term relationship with the person in question. So how can you prolong your engagement with your audience? How can you set up your bait for a future sell? And that's what you want to kind of think about if you're trying to set up a long-term relationship. So for example, you might be in a position where you can upsell or cross-sell other products and services to your particular client. And you want to keep this in mind as to how can you kind of give them like a teaser or a glimpse of what else you can do for them so that they will kind of remember you the next time they want something of that sort. Or you might want to talk about future ideas or a phase-wise proposal, where we used to do this quite often at my last job, where whenever we were making a pitch to a client, we would often end the pitch with like a futuristic version of the same solution that we showed them. So, if we showed them like a digital transformation solution, and then at the end, we'll give them a little teaser of like, what if we included AI in the solution at some point in the future? So we kind of give them like a little teaser of what a long-term solution or what a long-term engagement could look like with us, and kind of get them a little excited about what the possibilities are for the future. And we could present it as a phase-wise approach, saying, we can get to that in phase 4. And something that I tend to do in my personal practices. So for example, when a client comes to me with a specific inquiry and asks to see my portfolio. So for example, if they've come to ask me about publication design specifically, I'll send them a curated portfolio based on their need. For example, I will have a curated UX portfolio or a curated publication design portfolio or a branding portfolio. And based on whatever it is that they want to see, I will send them that. But at the end of that portfolio, I'll show them only the projects that they're interested to see, but I'll always end it with a page that lists all of the services or other services that I offer. So I will say, okay, this was a brief cross-section of my UX work. You can reach out to see my complete consulting portfolio, and then I will list out all of the other things that I do. But this is always this is kind of something as simple as this can also act as your cliffhanger, where it's just a way to give them a reason to come back to you and tell them, okay, I can do this for you, but I can also do all of these other things for you if you ever need it in the future. So you don't want to kind of dump it all on them right now, but you simply want to give them a brief glimpse of what you could do for them next. But essentially, the basic structure remains the same. You have your blurb, you have a hook, a premise, a climax, finally a closure, and then a cliffhanger if you want it or need it. But ultimately, no matter how you interpret these narrative devices, it all falls flat if you're unable to infuse them with a certain degree of emotion. Your premise will not seem problematic if you're unable to infuse it with a sense of urgency. Your closure may not be satisfying enough, and you leave them hanging if you don't give them a clear sense of the road ahead. Or if your cliffhanger is not relevant to them, it won't entice them to come back. So if your audience's emotional state is the same across every phase of the journey, then you're not really transforming them in any way. So you may have a ton of really useful information, but you always want to come back to the question, how are you situating it within an emotional framework? So that's all well and good. That structure is fairly understandable. So how do you generate emotion across this journey? How do you keep manipulating your audience's state of mind from one phase to the next? How do you create impact? How do you evoke empathy? How do you communicate priorities? And this is where I'm going to talk to you about how to use narrative micro techniques to achieve that up, down effect. So now it all comes down to rhythm. I'm going to read you this really excellent, famous paragraph that was written by Gary Prevost in 1985. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. Now, if you grasp the gist of this paragraph, that basically sums up this entire section. What you want to do is create rhythm. Now, Gary Prevost here shows you how to do it with words alone, but I'm going to show you how to do it structurally. So all of persuasion is a continuous battle between value versus time. So every minute that passes, you're trying to convince your audience that it was worth spending that minute on you. So how do you do this when you're structuring your content? The first thing that you want to do is set up a framework of expectations. So for example, you might know that your presentation is going to take 20 minutes or that your blog will take 5 minutes to read. You know that. But how do you subtly clue your audience in without explicitly telling them that? You want to give them a way to anticipate the structure of your content. So if I pick up a book, for example, I can feel how fat the book is. So I can roughly gauge how long it'll take me to read it. Or if I'm watching a movie, I know it's 2 hours long. And so I know how much of my time is going to get swallowed up watching that movie. That helps me orient myself. But when you're putting together a presentation, you're the one in control of that orientation. So it's your job to then provide the necessary cues to help orient your audience. You want to do the same thing for your audience. You have a particular structure and a flow to the thoughts in your head, but they're entering your thoughts completely blind. So you want to start by giving them some form of a map. And usually in a presentation, that might start with just showing them an agenda slide or a contents page. You know, it's just showing them, okay, this is the agenda of this presentation. This is the flow that we're going to go through. It could be as simple as that. Now, you don't have to be so obvious about it. There are other ways to give them a sense of structure too. For example, one is, of course, a sequential structure wherein you're just telling them, okay, these are the contents of this presentation. This is the order in which we're doing it. This is the agenda. Or you can choose to use a more thematic structure where you're saying, okay, these are the sort of themes that are going to be covered under this particular presentation. Or you might talk about process where, you're saying, okay, this is the process we're going to follow, and then you're going to dive deep into each of those phases of the process. Or you might want to, use like a time or a progress bar, the way that they have it in very lengthy blogs where you have to, you see your reading progress and you're able to gauge how much of the article is left to read. So there are many ways in which to kind of give them structure, and these little things give them a sense of structure, and it helps orient them in an otherwise blind scenario. And it puts them more at ease. It's a very subtle but important effect because you don't really realize it until it's actually happened, that it puts your audience in a greater sense of ease. And the next thing you want to do is then enable your audience to mirror your assumptions. So for example, if you are proposing a full UX revamp to a client, right? With all of your user research, you may know that your stakeholders' app is frustrating for users to use. You know that based on all of the users you've talked to. You might have talked to 50 users and you might have interviewed them and understood their pain points and all of that. And you've heard it all from the horse's mouth and you understand that. But how can you make your stakeholder perceive that same level of frustration? They haven't done all the research that you've done. They haven't talked to 50 different users like you have. They haven't heard their woes firsthand. So how do you recreate that state of mind for them? There are a few different subtle ways that you want to do this. So you want to go back to the information versus emotion framework, right? So for example, you can of course tell the client, users find your app really frustrating, but that's just conveying information to them. That's not really, that's not really helping them sense the same level of frustration. You can take it one step further and you can present a direct quote from the user instead, or maybe you're presenting like a user review, like an excerpt from a user review where the user is actually directly quoting something. And that takes it one step closer to recreating the experience. Better still, if you can take it even further and you can put a name and a face to that user. So if you can see the progression here, with every stage you're trying to frame that information within a stronger framework of emotion. So at every stage you want to ask yourself, what's the best way to recreate this experience for my audience? Not just tell them what it is, but a way to recreate the experience itself. The third thing that you want to do is create harmony between your content, your form, and your interaction. So what is the content of your pitch? What is the medium that you're presenting it in? And what are the interactions involved in that medium? And then when you identify these three things, you want to then create harmony between them, because that's what enables a greater sense of immersion. So for example, we all know how enjoyable it is to see an Instagram carousel post, right? With a long continuous image that you can scroll through. Now, why is that? It's because there's a deep sense of cohesion between what you're seeing, how you're seeing it, and how you're interacting with it. And that's what makes it more immersive, when you have that cohesion between these three things. So for example, if you're working with a slide-by-slide format, and I tend to do this pretty often, if you have a format like a presentation where you are transitioning from one slide to the next slide to the next slide, you can use those transitions to your advantage to highlight or select or deselect different things, So because you're already working in a format that allows you certain transitions, you can use that to your advantage to then kind of build that into the way in which you design your content as well. So we all kind of know and use these intuitively, right? The greater the harmony, the deeper the immersion. So we already know that, for example, it is more immersive to see a 16 by 9 image on a 16 by 9 screen, far more than seeing a 4 by 3 image on a 16 by 9 screen. We know this intuitively. And of course, there may be people who are not necessarily designers or creative professionals, and it might be less obvious to them. The point is, you want to become really conscious of it, because once you become conscious of it, that allows you to kind of wield these techniques in a far more intentional way. You're not just doing it by accident, or you're not just doing it unconsciously. You want to reach a point where you're doing it very, very consciously and intentionally, so that you can start using those to your benefit. Another important thing you want to start to do is to visualize the structure and flow of your content. So whether you're working on slides or a written proposal or a web page, you want to start seeing the various elements in terms of units, and then you want to visualize the flow and the relationships between those units. So for example, is the flow getting too monotonous? Do you have too many similar looking slides or pages one after another? If you do, then how can you break that flow? If you have too many similar case studies, then how about you do 2 long case studies and then do a quick combo of 4 shorter case studies in a single slide? So you want to start seeing these things in terms of units, and you want to start visualizing the flow. So when you start doing that, you'll be able to kind of sense patterns, and you'll be able to see when something's becoming too monotonous. You can sense when interest is starting to dip. And if you have too many informative slides in a row, then you'll realize, okay, you want to break the flow with some kind of high impact visual or statistic or something of the sort. You also want to be very conscious of time versus density. So it's almost never about the number of slides. It's more about the density of content and how much time or effort each piece or each slide or each page demands. So for example, if you have 5 text-heavy slides, that can be far more dense and heavy to consume than 20 slides with short one-liners that are interspersed with images. You also kind of want to be aware of where you're setting up points of anticipation and reward. So we tend to do these unconsciously, but you want to make sure that anytime you set up any kind of question, you're always resolving it with an answer. So if it's a quick question or it's not a particularly important or momentous question, the answer can come soon after. But if it's a big, lofty question, you might want to wait and build up to the answer at the end of the presentation. But you want to stay aware of when and where you position these so that you're very aware of, okay, you've set up a question at a certain place, or you've set up an unmet expectation at a certain place in the presentation. You want to make sure that you're resolving it and you're tying up any loose ends before you reach the end of your presentation. Now, whenever you're making a particularly long or a dense pitch, what you want to do is continuously reorient your audience. And you do this by bringing back their sense of time. So whenever a flow has gotten very long or monotonous, you think that engagement might be dipping, what you want to do is bring back their sense of time. You're trying to get them immersed. And then when you find that anything is dipping or becoming a little too monotonous, you want to bring back that sense of time. And all you have to do is give them a sense of where they are in the structure of your pitch. So you can do this simply with section dividers, show them that they're in part 1 or part 2 or part 3, because that'll help them get a sense of time again. It's just like how, when you're watching a movie and you occasionally hover to check the timestamp because you want to see, okay, how much time is left. It doesn't mean that you're not enjoying the movie. You just want to get a sense of time, and you want to get a sense of how much time you have left in consuming this. And you just want to know where you are in the flow and how much is left to go. So, but when you're the one making the presentation, it's your job to give them their sense of time and help them reorient themselves at regular intervals. And finally, and very, very importantly, you want to incorporate highly specific expressive phrasing. The words we choose are very, very important because words are very visual structural things. Words have the ability to create a picture, a structure, an experience in your minds. So it feels different to say, we have a great experience versus we have vast experience. You can feel the difference between those two phrases. Those two words create entirely different experiences in our minds. Similarly, it feels different to say your user has a history of versus your user has a long history of. Again, you can feel the difference in the weight of those two sentences, right? Because they're structurally different and they're creating a different picture in your mind entirely. So you want to make sure that you're using words that create the most vivid experience in your audience's mind. And you want to make sure you're using expressive forms of phrasing and very specific forms of phrasing to kind of create that picture. Ultimately, like I said earlier, it's all about rhythm, and rhythm is all about structure. So you always want to return to the question, what structure did I make my audience experience during this? And finally, I want to talk about visualizing ideas. So whenever possible, you want to find ways to visualize the things that you're talking about, especially when it comes to a new, undeveloped idea or a concept, which is usually the case if you're making a pitch, right? So we all, of course, know that mockups are a great way to visualize anything from packaging to mobile apps to branding. But I want to talk a little bit about other techniques of visualization that can come in handy during a pitch. Especially when we're in an early stage of pitching, we may not always have a fully developed concept or a design to create a mockup. Or for those who aren't creative professionals, they may not be in a position to create highly refined mockups. So in that case, how else can we go about visualizing what we're talking about? One is, of course, as we know, data visualization can help really drive a point home. But what you want to do is conserve your efforts for those cases where visualization will really make a marked impact. In a lot of cases, if you put up a big statistic in like a bold font, or like it has an impressive sort of number that really kind of shocks people out of their boots, that alone can do it. You don't necessarily need a visualization for every type of data or statistics. But where you want to use data visualization is in a very strategic way where you're able to show some kind of drastic variation or contrast or scale that can be visualized. So for example, I mean, this is a more artistic example, but it will still make my point. This artist, Chris Jordan, creates these massive digital collages that he takes the raw numbers and data and kind of turns them into these massive digital collages, and then he prints them to scale to depict, whatever the data is in its most raw format. So for example, this is a piece he created that shows, I think, 1 million plastic cups stacked to represent how many cups are used in a day in America or something of that sort. But basically 1 million, he literally created a digital collage of 1 million plastic cups stacked over each other. And what he does is he then prints these giant, and then he's able to kind of show what it's like in relation to human scale if a human were to stand next to this collage. And so you can really kind of feel the weight of those raw numbers in the way that he does that, right? So he's able to then use data in a way that really kind of drives the numbers home and creates impact. And it's not just visualization for the sake of visualization. It's really kind of creating an effect of its own. And then, of course, as a lot of you would know, a consumer journey map can be really useful, a really useful form of early visualization when it comes to service design, systems design, even in the cases of spatial design or retail design, an exhibition concept and things like that, anything that involves kind of flow or movement. But other forms of more a preliminary or raw visualization is one is mood boards. And this is a step that I always go through for most of my projects, especially if it's involving a visual language, if it's packaging or branding or, even if it's like an illustration kind of project, where you want to kind of give them a sense. You don't want to have to create any artifacts from scratch, but you want to give them a sense of the kind of visual language that you have in mind. And this can be incredibly important in the early pitching stage of any kind of client conversation, because I find with a lot of my conversations with mentees and with young artists, designers, students especially, I find that there's often a mismatch. They have experiences where there's a mismatch in communication with their client, where maybe the client expected a certain kind of illustration style, and then when they finally got it, he realized this wasn't really close to what he had in mind. And so it becomes then really kind of crucial to get on the same page early on, especially when it comes to things that involve visual language of any sort, where you want to put together a kind of a mood board or something to say, okay, this is the sort of direction I'm going in. Are we on the same page? Another thing that I tend to do in a lot of my pitches, so when I'm working with clients, especially when it comes to brand strategy, there's a phase during which I usually like to kind of paint a long-term vision, a long-term picture of what branding with this client can look like, where I tell them, okay, maybe we can do this, and we can also do little things like this, or we can, revamp the way that you go about, your luggage tags, or the way that you do your social media. But it's still at an early state of the conversation, and I'm not going to sit and actually design any artifacts, any final artifacts to be able to mock up for them. So what I tend to do is I often find it really handy to combine rough sketches with sample images. So I show like an example of like a photographic example of what I'm talking about. And then I combine it with a quick rough sketch that shows them how I'm going to adapt that sort of thing to their particular brand. So for example, if I'm showing them luggage, like customized luggage tags or something like that, then I show them like a little sketch of what that might look like in their scenario. Or if in one particular project where I was proposing like this, creating like this souvenir wall with little souvenirs collected from various projects, where I'm again pairing a photograph with a quick sketch that explains my idea in better detail. And then, of course, this was part of a pitch that I had worked on in collaboration with an interior design studio that I often work with, where it's basically what I often tend to do is create like some kind of like a rough sketch or an illustration to explain an overall concept. And this comes quite in handy when you're trying to explain a spatial design concept, but in a way where, I mean, you haven't really reached the stage where you've figured out measurements or you've figured out an actual floor plan, but you still want to give whoever it is, you want to give your client a sense of what you want to do with that space. And you kind of, can use this this type of visualization. And then another thing that I often like to do is then I like to, again, pair it with photographs to better explain whatever it is I'm talking about. So then I will number certain portions of it and then be able to link those to specific photographs, as you can see here. And then, of course, there are flow maps where you can illustrate possible parts of movement or interaction. You, of course, if you're feeling ambitious and you want to create like an explainer video or a journey video, and this can be particularly handy if it's like it's an important or a significant pitch, because that can really kind of help excite whoever it is that you're pitching to and give them a real vivid sense of whatever it is that you're trying to sell to them. And what I also like to do is, even in written proposals, I sometimes prefer to kind of include very simple diagrams or visualizations just to kind of reinforce the concept, because ultimately visualizations don't always have to be highly refined or sophisticated. They just have to help your audience get a rough idea of what it is that you see in your head. Because especially when it comes to creative professionals or design professionals or artists and things like that, you are often you are already thinking in very visual terms, and your audience or your client is usually not at the same at the same wavelength as you when it comes to visualizing things. So you want to kind of help them see whatever it is that you are seeing with such clarity in your head, and you just have to give them a rough idea, but you do want to kind of give them that rough idea. And finally, the last thing I want to touch upon is how to adapt your pacing and rhythm and structure based on the medium of pitching. So medium of delivery is a crucial aspect of any pitch, and modifying your structure to complement your delivery can literally be a make or break tactic. So for example, if it's an in-person presentation, in an in-person presentation, your job is to manipulate their sense of time and to create a dynamic up-down rhythm, especially if it's a long pitch. So even if you have a lot of content, it's okay as long as you're able to create a light-footed sense of rhythm. And what I mean by that is literally kind of dance through your presentation in this very agile way, and you want to dance through your sections at a good pace where it doesn't feel like you're droning on and on about any one thing for too long. You want to literally be very light-footed in the way that you traverse through your content. When it comes to a PDF or an email attachment, you're not manipulating time. Your goal is then to manipulate their sense of density. Now, this is where you definitely want to keep track of how many pages you have. You want to keep your page count low because you want to give them a sense that this is not very dense content. You don't want them to, feel put off by the density. And this is also where you want to kind of provide a snapshot in your covering email. You want to think about how you're leading them into your particular attachment. You want to think about how those elements work together. When it comes to a written proposal, it is incredibly important to make it skimmable, because whoever it is going to skim. They're not really going to read it entirely at least not at first. At first, they're definitely going to skim. So you want to make it skimmable, and you can do this through, when I create written proposals, I try to do it in various ways through typographic hierarchy, and I create pull quotes so that they can quickly get a glimpse of something. I create highlights, and I highlight certain lines of text. I look for what I also do is kind of, use phrasing in a way that aids their skimming process. So for example, I will use a super heading and then a heading. So for example, as you can see here, impact and engagement is the super heading. And then the heading itself says, creating a cycle that can give back to community. Or the super heading says the context or the problem. And then I use a question format to then phrase the actual heading and make it more conversational. So you get the technical aspect of it as well as you get the conversational aspect of it. And you want to kind of, the way you phrase your titles and headings becomes very key, because those act as your main story sections when it comes to a written proposal. In an elevator pitch, you basically cover your same narrative phases, but you might in this case want to kind of combine some of them into one. So for example, you may want to combine your hook and your premise. You may want to find a way to turn your problem itself into your hook. You may ditch the cliffhanger altogether, and you may focus simply on the climax, on what your big idea is, and then quickly close with why you're capable of making it happen. And you want to hit each point really hard, almost in like a headline fashion. So you don't go into every problem, you pick the most poignant one. You don't list all your credentials, you list the most impressive or the most relevant one. Think about what a journalist would focus on if they were writing a headline about you, and use that to kind of orient yourself, because this is about capitalizing on what other people think is most interesting about you, not what you think is great about yourself, but what other people might quickly, immediately perceive to be most interesting about you. When it's a web page, you want to kind of, you want your blurb and your hook occurring right within your banner itself, followed by the other phases, right? And you want to kind of treat it in a funnel structure. So you want to be careful of how many interaction points you include. So often what happens is when you're putting together a web page, you have this tendency, or you have this instinct to kind of link everything, like everything that can be linked to another page or another place. you have this tendency to kind of link everything, but you want to be careful of how many interaction points you include, because each link is then an opportunity for them to leave this page and leave this particular flow. So you want to make sure you funnel them downwards towards the action that you actually want them to perform. And, and then of course you have your point of closure then becomes your CTA. Your cliffhanger can be like a little section after that, it might be, other projects or similar projects. And you have ways to kind of interpret these various narrative phases on a web page as well. When it comes to a physical exhibit, your blurb, your hook, your premise, all will usually get combined into a single concept note. So you then want to write that concept note and structure that concept note using that flow and that logic. And then your work itself becomes the climax or the closure or the cliffhanger then becomes, whatever they take away from that exhibition. Maybe they're taking away a certain piece of ephemera, or they're taking away a brochure or a memento or something of that sort. And you want that then becomes your closure, that becomes your cliffhanger. And finally, when it comes to a portfolio, the perspective shifts just a little, because in a portfolio, you are at once the product, the service, the protagonist. So it turns into more of kind of a character story. It's more about who you are and what you do. But the structure still roughly remains the same. So you will still want to start with your blurb of describing what you are in a succinct way, whether that's a graphic designer or a product designer or an artist or an entrepreneur. You may want to choose to deliver your hook here. For example, I'm a service designer who likes to solve complex, wicked problems. That could be your hook. Your premise can then become a brief nutshell of who you are, what your experience and background is, what you specialize in. So you could think about this almost like your summary section on LinkedIn and what you would put there. And your climax then becomes the meat of your portfolio, your work itself, your projects, your case studies. Again, you can create rhythm here. Not every case study needs to be long or expanded. Some can be 2 pages, some can be a 1-pager case study. For shorter case studies, you can showcase 3 on a page. You can adjust your flow to show which projects have greater priority in your mind. And you want to kind of structure, you want to again visualize the flow of your content and arrange it in a way that is pleasing and relevant to you. And then, of course, you can close with things like your resume or your qualifications, your clientele, other services, things like that. Whatever it is, you want to be very thoughtful about your medium and the nature of its interactions, and you want to craft your pitch accordingly. So you want to be very aware of these things and how they kind of tend to interact with each other. And finally, subtlety is key. You want to show, don't tell. Don't tell your audience what you're about to do. Don't tell them you're going to wrap up in 5 minutes. Just do it. Don't tell them that this presentation is only 10 slides long. You won't take up much of their time. Just show them. Don't make disclaimers and don't make apologies as much as you can help it. And I know when people do this, they do it thinking that they're just being polite or considerate. But the thing is, even if you are being polite or considerate, you're greatly undercutting yourself in the process, because what you do is when you do that, you kind of pull them out of the immersion, and then you're making them very conscious of you and your motives. So they'll be on alert and they'll be more wary of you. They'll be watching closely for whatever it is that you mentioned, So it creates a slight sense and a slight degree of suspicion where they're extra wary of the fact that you're trying to sell them something. And you don't want them to be so hyper conscious of it. You want them to get immersed, and you want to make them care about your idea in the way that you care about it. And you can't do that if you start off on a note of suspicion. So you don't want to say things that can kind of pull them out of the immersion, right? Because ultimately, the thing that you want to kind of constantly remind yourself of is good persuasion doesn't tell you what to do. It makes you think that you want to do it. And that's the thing that you want to keep reminding yourself. So thank you very much. I've enjoyed putting this together for all of you, and I hope you found it useful and relevant to your practice. I'm now happy to have a conversation with all of you, hear any comments or questions you may have. So I'll hand it over to Arshla and Aryendra in case they've gathered any questions across the session. So thanks very much. And I suppose we can have more of a free-flowing conversation now.
Thank you, Ruchika. That was, we actually spectated truly an art of storytelling by you.
Thank you. I'm glad it came out that way. That is definitely hopefully the goal in every presentation. So if that's how it came off, then I'm very glad.
Yeah. So we have like a couple of questions. The one of the questions is from Anubha. Are there any online visual resources that you use that are available for free?
Online visual resources. can't say that I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag when it comes to, it depends on what sort of visualization I might be creating. So for example, if it's some kind of a, like I said, I do a lot of things where I kind of combine quick rough sketches with, photographs and things like that. So that's kind of a mix of things. Is there any specific tool that I use? Not really. It's usually things that I tend to create by myself from scratch, or I combine a variety of elements, but there's no specific go-to sort of resource that I have when it comes to ways to visualize things.
Okay.
Ruchika, I think a great example is your presentation today. We saw a lot of good visuals being used in that. So maybe some examples of references of how you have got to them might help.
So most of those in the presentation itself, especially things like the flow, visualizing the flow and things like that, are really just things that I create on my own, because and that's stuff that you can kind of just literally create on your presentation software itself, right? Whether you're using a PowerPoint or a Keynote or InDesign or whatever it is that you're using, where I tend to kind of, if it's simple shapes and icons like that. And then of course you have a lot of like free vector resources and image resources that you can use from online that you put together. So if I'm using images to put together a presentation, it's usually just free resources like that that I get from online. But when it comes to like little diagrams and things like that, or little sketches, it's usually stuff that I create by myself, because I usually have a very specific idea of what it is that I'm trying to communicate. So it's honestly much faster to just kind of create it from scratch by myself than trying to look for the appropriate one online, or trying to find something online.
Okay, just an insider question from my side.
Sure.
Which specifically tool you use for this particular slide deck?
This one, so I had created some of these slides I had created on InDesign a while ago, because this is part of a presentation I had done some time back. And then the rest of it is literally just on Keynote, because I find it much faster when I'm creating presentations, especially when it involves a lot of explanation and things like that. I find it much faster to use a presentation software itself, like Keynote or PowerPoint, because I can include my presenter notes and things like that within the tool itself. That's something that I find I can't really do when I would love to be able to design everything on InDesign, because that's my tool of choice, my go-to tool of choice whenever I'm creating any sort of a sequential document. But I find it's much more logistically convenient to create it on a presentation software like Keynote, and that's what I end up using for today's thing. So it's mostly on Keynote.
Okay, so we had one more question from Sai. Sai, would that be okay if you would open up your mic and ask that by yourself? I think that would
be great. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be more great.
Okay. Hi everyone. Am I audible properly?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, this was a great session. I had just one question. So while we're giving a presentation, in order to keep the listeners attentive and engaged, it's important to take in questions.
Right.
That are faced are, if I give them the free range to ask questions whenever they have doubts or they don't understand something, my flow gets interrupted.
Right.
On the other hand, if I keep all questions to the end of the session, then at some point they phase out, and after that, understand things and I have to repeat the same things again.
Yeah.
So would it be better to make it clear at the beginning that you'll be given an opportunity to ask questions at these specific intervals of time? Let's say every 15 minutes, I'll open the stage for questions. Would that be a good way to go about it?
So I would say that definitely you want to, if especially if you're making like a long sort of presentation or a pitch, and you want to give them opportunities to ask questions in the middle of the flow somewhere, you want to do it in a way that's slightly orchestrated, so that you are not thrown out of your rhythm, and you're not they're not just jumping in with a question whenever they think of it. But I wouldn't say to do it in terms of time, like you're saying, maybe ask questions every 15 minutes. I would say instead, when you're structuring your presentation, think about where you can have a logical pause in your content. Like maybe it's at the end of every section, or maybe it's at the end of every 2 sections, after you finish 2 sections, where there's a logical pause in your content, and then you can pause and open up the floor to questions, saying, okay, if there are any questions at this phase, you can take them in at that time. So I wouldn't say, so if you structure it based on time, that can eventually box you in, and you can be kind of stuck in that format where you may not be ready to take questions every 15 minutes, depending on the flow of your presentation. So you want to look at the structure of your presentation, or your whatever it is that you are talking about, and see in terms of content, where is a logical pause, or where is a logical full stop, where you can kind of take a pause and then take questions at that point. And you can tell them that beforehand, that there will be certain intervals during which you can ask questions. So you can kind of set them up for it in the beginning. But I would say don't structure it based on time, structure it based on the logic of your content.
Great, great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have one question from Sagar. Hi, Ruchika, very insightful presentation. He says that are there any books that you would recommend for storytelling and communicating your ideas to your peers or clients?
That's a good question. For me, my references usually, I mean, I read a lot of books, but usually not necessarily with regard to this, because this is the sort of stuff I usually kind of try to kind of figure out the structure of myself. So I can't really think of any books specifically, but I do know of some. They're not really coming to me right now, but I think I will keep, if there's a way for me to kind of contact this group later, and then I will put together a set of resources. I am in fact planning to kind of turn the same content of this presentation into more of a concise kind of a cheat sheet or a guide that I would be happy to share with all of you as soon as it's ready. So in that, I might include like a list of resources. Let me kind of ruminate on that and think about what books or resources would be useful for this sort of thing, and then put that together in that.
Sure. Since many of them asked about the recording and key takeaways from the session, so we would love that to have that on our LinkedIn design community group.
Definitely.
So I've also sent the link for the same. So any of you, if you haven't joined it yet, you may join that, and we'll be sharing everything there. So one last question, I guess, from Vishnu. Closing is crucially important. So there might be customers who demand more time to think over the product you are selling. What do you do then?
Can you say that again? Come again?
Okay. Closing is crucially important. So there might be customers who demand more time to think over the product you are selling.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do then?
So that's a sort of both a boon and a curse in the professional space, I suppose, because on the one hand, if they are taking time to think about it, that could even be a good sign that they actually want to really seriously consider whatever it is that you're pitching for them, rather than being disinterested about it. On the other hand, it can also mean that they're just kind of trying to buy time before they say no to you. That is ultimately something that you can't really you can't entirely plan for it, but after we make our pitch, there's always some kind of a takeaway for them, in terms of like actually giving them, like sharing with them, say, the more tangible aspects of your plan. So for example, if you ended on the note of your say your execution roadmap, or your your timeline, or a phase-wise execution plan, or whatever it is that's more tangible, and it's a way for them to kind of really kind of think about this project in a very real sense. Those were maybe aspects that we would then put together in a shorter deck and send to them as a reference material later, so that they can kind of, they take that away with them, and they take some time to kind of think about it and go over it in the comfort of their own solitude, without us in front of them, without us pitching to them, where they can kind of like look at it and say, okay, maybe this is, if we do it as a phase-wise plan, maybe it's not a bad idea. So you want to kind of leave them with something that makes them think, that kind of gives them some sense of an actionable next step, such that it makes it kind of tangible for them. Because when you're pitching to them, you're trying to give them this really kind of glorious vision of what you can do for them, and that can be a little bit up in the air sometimes. So you want to kind of bring them back down to reality, and kind of give them something that ties them to the real world and says, okay, we can actually do this if you guys want to go ahead with it, and give them something that kind of gives a sense of, gives some proof or evidence of that. So that could be in terms of like, you could say, okay, we'll send you like we'll send you like a deck of like our execution roadmap, so that you can go over it at your leisure in your time, and you can kind of go over the details and figure out whether you want to do this. So you want to kind of set them up for thinking about you in a positive way, but obviously there's no way to ultimately control how they choose to make their decision, but you want to set them up for success.
Yeah. I guess we are done with the questions. Thank you so much, Ruchika, for responding everyone, and like taking up all the questions and answering them like descriptively. Vishnu is asking like, okay, we'll take this as a last one.
Sure.
How did you sell your dollhouse?
How did I sell my dollhouse? I never actually had to sell it at any point. It was a personal project that it is a personal project that I have here. I don't know if you mean sell it as in physically sell it, or do you mean just sell the idea? But if you mean selling the idea, then I had to do that while putting together my press kits for the project, not physically. Okay. I had to do that, definitely had to do that when I was putting together press kits for the project to send out to various, magazines and things like that for featuring the project. And that was actually a very difficult process, because it's far more difficult to put together a pitch for something that is very close to you or very personal to you, because it's very difficult to be objective about it and, kind of whittle it down to whatever is, kind of important. In that case, it's very sort of, I think it's a very important thing to kind of have somebody else, like an external reference point, someone to bounce it off of, or someone to give you a more objective sense of things. And now for the dollhouse, for making the dollhouse, I collaborated with an interior design studio called Studio Slip. And so I was working with their founder, creative director, a friend of mine, Kamini Rao, and she was kind of my external point of reference to say, okay, you know what, no, these pictures are, or this part of the project it's too, you're going on about it too much. It's not the most interesting part. So she was able to kind of give me a sense of what is it about the project that is most interesting. So it's always a good idea to have some kind of external reference point, especially if the project is something that's very close to you. So you want somebody to kind of give you a sense of objectivity and be able to tell you, okay, these are the points that are really interesting. These are the points that you can get to later. You don't have to get to it in this initial pitch. But I'm hoping that selling the dollhouse was a fairly successful process when it came to the press kits, because we were very lucky to get a feature by Architectural Digest that came out of, we were very surprised to get that. So I think that was hopefully an indication that the pitch was successful.